Here now to give his take on President Obama's Afghan strategy, former National Security Advisor to President Carter and my dad, Dr. Brzezinski. He's what are you laughing at? He's also co-author.
You see the smile on his face there? He was really moved by that.
Just trying to get through this. Don't interrupt me. Author of America and the World, Conversations on the Future of American Foreign Policy. Dad, thanks for being with us.
Dr. Brzezinski, the president didn't have a lot of good options last night. What was your take on his speech?
Overall, I thought it was a good speech. Overall, I think he has defined a constructive, positive approach, which hopefully will permit him to do what he aims to do, which is to begin gradual disengagement in about 18 or so months.
Dr. Brzezinski, last night, one of the lines, I agreed with much that the president said last night, but one of the lines that I took exception with, that you've actually taken exception with for about a year now, was the suggestion that the Taliban somehow was a threat to U.S. vital interests. Why is the Taliban not a threat to U.S. vital interests?
Because there's a significant difference between the Taliban's aims and Al-Qaeda's aims, and both have been quite explicit on the subject. The Taliban essentially wants to create a rather fundamentalist, we would say medieval society in Afghanistan, basing it on the rural elements of the population, the more backward elements of the population. Al-Qaeda is a globally oriented terrorist organization with a particular fixation on the United States and on some parts of Western Europe.
So given the dynamics of what you've just laid out there, is this plan and the timing involved, 18 months, realistic?
I think it's a realistic approach. I don't know whether the date specifically is realistic, and only time will tell. But by and large, I think the president has redefined rather substantially the aims of the military presence in Afghanistan and the way we're supposed to handle the problem as a whole. There are some ambiguities left, and I'm not certain about some aspects of what he was talking about, in part, I assume, because he also has to be careful regarding what not to say. But let me give you a couple of examples. We're not going to give General McChrystal all the troops he wanted. He wanted between 40 and maybe even 60,000. He's going to get 30,000. But their purpose, I think, is going to be different. In other words, we're not going to be waging an active counterinsurgency. We're going to be concentrating on holding what is, so to speak, secure, containing the Taliban, while preparing the Afghans to do the heavy lifting. The ambiguity is, who will these Afghans be? How will that be organized? Who will be recruited? And we can come back to that. The second ambiguity is Pakistan. He very rightly emphasized that Pakistan is a key to success. And he emphasized that we want a genuine partnership with Pakistan. The question here is, how convincing and how reassuring can we be to Pakistan regarding Afghanistan's future? The Pakistanis are obsessed with the concern that a non-Taliban Afghanistan could end up being more friendly to India than to Pakistan. How far are we prepared to reassure them? And the third question or ambiguity is, what is it that we really expect the Europeans to do, more specifically? And I guess that will be addressed in that major conference to which the United States would be going, and which the Germans and the French and the British proposed.
Dr. Brzezinski, Arianna Huffington is with us, and she's got a question. Arianna.
Dr. Brzezinski, over the last 2 months, many members of the administration were going around saying that our strategy in Afghanistan depends on having a reliable partner. Now, the government of Karzai is no more reliable and no less corrupt today than it has been for years. So what's changing? How can this strategy succeed without a reliable partner?
You know, I think that kind of talk is really not constructive or responsible. I'm referring not to what you're saying, but what you're quoting. If we're going to keep denouncing Karzai and the existing government, we better have an alternative in our pocket that's better and that we know about. And the fact is, we don't have an alternative. And Karzai should not be maligned the way he is. He was one of the very few Afghans who was willing to go in there and oppose the Taliban after 9/11. And while he's not perfect, I personally, and I sort of have followed this issue for years, do not know of anyone else who can take charge and do much better. And last but not least, who are we to be preaching to the Afghans about the importance of eliminating corruption? Let's take a look at our own system before we start preaching to the world about the importance of eliminating corruption.
Okay, Mike Barnacle.
Hey, Doctor, let's stick with that last thought for a second.
Okay.
General Petraeus was talking about the issues of governance versus security in Afghanistan, and which took a higher priority, and could you have one without the other? My question to you is, if you could, look 3, 4, 5 years down the road, do you think Afghanistan, say 3 years from now, will have a look and a feel in terms of governance and security that is different than it is right now?
Well, in a way, I hope that it's not too different, but that it's better. The notion of creating a central government in Afghanistan that's viable and is in full control of the country is, in my judgment, unrealistic and, in fact, in conflict with the realities of Afghanistan, not to mention its history. Afghanistan is a complicated compromise formula based on traditions, customs, based on a rather, shall we put it in terms of our own standards, pre-modern society. It's an ethnic compromise. You know, there are very few real Afghans in Afghanistan. There are Pashtun Afghans, there are Tajik Afghans, Uzbek Afghans, Kyrgyz, Turkmeni, Hazaras, and so forth. We have to face that reality, and this is one of the ambiguities in the speech. The president, in effect, I think, has indicated that we're not going to be waging a very active, Americanized counterinsurgency, and that's all to the good, because that could breed more resistance from the Afghans, because they don't like foreigners, basically. But we have to have Afghans who do it. General McChrystal wanted a national army. I don't think a national army is possible in Afghanistan.
Well, okay, so
we have to raise local militias, and they have to carry on the struggle against Taliban.
But off of that description that you just gave of a very ethnic Afghanistan, would it not be logic to conclude that the Taliban is just as ethnic, just as bifurcated as is the population, and thus we're not dealing with a monolith when we deal with the Taliban?
Oh, you're absolutely right, and this is why I support the idea, for example, and I've been talking about that for a couple of years, of local accommodations wherever that is possible. But I also support not raising a huge Afghan national army, which I think is just not going to work, but of raising local militias based on local people who are in a better position to go after the Taliban, which is hiding somewhere in the sticks or in the mountains, because I don't think we should be doing that.
But why are we going after the Taliban when our enemy is Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda is in Pakistan?
Because we don't want a Taliban in control of the country as a whole, thereby in a position to provide safe havens. You're quite right in mentioning Pakistan, but to beat the Taliban back, to prevent safe havens in Afghanistan, we have to have local people doing that hard, heavy lifting. And then on top of it, we have to cut a deal with the Pakistanis so that the Pakistanis have an incentive in eliminating the more significant and more radical Taliban base which exists in southwest Pakistan.
So, Dr. Brzezinski, bottom line this for us. Do you believe it's in America's best interest to leave Afghanistan as soon as practical, as soon as it's practical?
Well, the catchword here is practical. How do you define practical? I would say, yes, of course we should leave as soon as possible or as practical, but that to me means that there is no Taliban government in charge of a kind of ethnically diverse but otherwise medieval and anti-Western Afghanistan.
Well, Doc, how can we ever guarantee that? Dr. Brzezinski?
We can't guarantee that. The question is, how can we pursue it? What kind of strategies are more likely to achieve it? And I think a combination of American presence, to hold populated centers, and the president referred that, to hold the major towns, to hold the major communication arteries, and then to push the Taliban back into smaller and smaller areas around villages, but letting the local people then chase them, so to speak, in the sticks. That, I think, has a better chance of succeeding than us trying to wage a nationwide counterinsurgency.
We just can't do it.
All right.
Dr. Brzezinski, thank you so much. Say bye to your dad.
Thank you, Dad. I'll call you later. We appreciate it. Good to have you back
nice
on the
to be
show.
with you.